Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video explores the sociological and historical evolution of divorce and its impact on paternal social structures. The information provided is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, psychological, or professional advice. Issues involving family law, custody, and mental health are highly complex and vary significantly by jurisdiction and individual circumstance. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding their specific situations. In 1950, the concept of the disposable father was virtually non-existent in the American lexicon. Today, it is a statistical reality that defines the landscape of the modern U.S. household. Consider this: within just a few years of a marital breakdown, a staggering percentage of fathers in the United States report feeling like visitors in their own children's lives, or worse, becoming completely socially untethered from the communities they helped build. We are currently witnessing a silent epidemic of social atomization that has been brewing for over half a century. It is a phenomenon where the very men who were once the primary link between the family unit and the outside world find themselves in a vacuum of isolation, often with no blueprint for how to reconstruct a social identity outside of a nuclear family framework. Why did the American legal and social system evolve to facilitate this specific type of masculine solitude? And why is the modern divorced father more likely to experience chronic loneliness than almost any other demographic in the Western world? Over the next 10 parts of this deep dive, we are going to deconstruct the historical machinery that created this isolation, from the tender years doctrine to the collapse of fraternal organizations, revealing why the lonely dad isn't just a trope, but a calculated byproduct of historical shifts in American policy and culture. This exploration solves a critical problem for the modern American viewer. It provides the why behind a felt reality that is often dismissed as personal failure. By the end of this masterclass, you will understand the structural, legal, and historical forces that dictate the social outcomes of divorced men, allowing for a clearer, more objective view of the contemporary family crisis. To understand the isolation of the modern divorced father, we must first examine the massive shift in how the U.S. legal system defined the essential parent. Historically, in the early 19th century, fathers were actually the preferred custodians in the rare event of a divorce. Under English common law, which heavily influenced early American jurisprudence, children were viewed almost as property or heirs to the paternal estate. However, as the Industrial Revolution took hold and men moved from the family farm to the factory, a new cultural philosophy emerged: the tender years doctrine. This was the first major historical pivot toward paternal isolation. It suggested that during their tender years, children required the unique nurturance of a mother. While this may seem like a natural sentiment today, it was a radical shift that began the process of legally and socially distancing fathers from the domestic core. By the mid-20th century, this doctrine had solidified into a rigid social expectation. When the no-fault divorce revolution hit in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the legal system was already primed to view the father as the secondary social actor in the home. This set the stage for a unique form of American isolation. When a marriage dissolved in 1975, the father didn't just lose a partner. He often lost his primary social secretary. Historically, in the American middle class, the wife often performed the kin-keeping labor. She was the one who scheduled dinners with other couples, maintained the holiday cards, and kept the family integrated into the local PTA or church groups. When the divorce occurred, the man was frequently severed from this entire social infrastructure. Because he had been socialized to focus on professional provision rather than social networking, he found himself in a quiet apartment with no one to call on a Friday night, not because he was unlikable, but because his social capital had been managed by a department that was now closed to him. This isolation is further exacerbated by the breadwinner trap. For decades, the American male's social value was tied almost exclusively to his utility as a provider. In a historical context, a man's social standing in his community was reinforced by his ability to maintain a stable, nuclear household. When that household breaks, the utility is called into question. Data from the late 20th century suggests that divorced men often feel a sense of social shame that prevents them from reaching out to their remaining peers. They disappear from the golf course, the bowling league, or the neighborhood barbecue because they no longer fit the profile of the successful suburban patriarch. Let's look at a case study of the 1980s weekend dad. This era saw the rise of the specialized commercial industry catering to divorced fathers, the divorce hotels, and the rise of bachelor pad aesthetics. However, beneath the surface of this consumerist pivot was a profound loss of community. These men were often living in temporary corporate housing or sterile apartments, separated from the neighborhoods where their children lived. The physical distance created a psychological barrier. In the US, geography is often destiny when it comes to social integration. When a father moves even 15 miles away from the school district, he is no longer seeing the other parents at the grocery store or the local park. He becomes a ghost in his own former life. This geographical displacement is a primary driver of the isolation we see today. Furthermore, the decline of third places in America, the barbershops, fraternal lodges, and community centers, hit divorced men particularly hard. In the 1920s, a divorced man might have found solace and a sense of belonging at his local Elks Lodge or Mason's Hall. These were gender-specific spaces that provided a safety net of male camaraderie. As these institutions declined in the latter half of the century, replaced by privatized, home-centered leisure, the divorced man lost his last refuge. Without a third place to go to, and without a first place, the home that felt like his own, he was left in a social limbo. We must also address the disenfranchised grief that accompanies this historical trend. In American culture, there is a clear ritual for the death of a spouse, but there is no ritual for the death of a marriage for a man. The social expectation is often to move on or get back out there. But the data shows that the social recovery for men is frequently much slower than for women. Women are more likely to have deep, platonic emotional support networks. Men, historically conditioned to view their wives as their sole emotional confidants, find themselves not just alone, but without the skills to build new, deep bonds with other men. This creates a feedback loop of isolation. The lonelier the man becomes, the more his social skills atrophy, and the harder it becomes to reintegrate into a community. As we move forward in this series, we will examine how the digital age and the rise of the manosphere have attempted to fill this void, often with mixed results. We will look at how the 1990s legal reforms regarding joint custody tried, and often failed, to bridge this social gap. But to understand the present, we must acknowledge that this isolation isn't a new glitch in the system. It is the logical conclusion of a century of American social and legal history that prioritized maternal domesticity and paternal utility, leaving the divorced father as a man without a country. In the next part, we will dive deep into the 1970s no-fault era, and how the sudden shift in legal standing caught an entire generation of American men off guard, creating the first mass wave of socially isolated fathers in the modern age. To understand the 1970s as a catalyst for paternal isolation, we have to look at the seismic shift in the legal landscape of the United States. Before 1969, divorce in most states required a showing of fault, adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. This meant that the dissolution of a marriage was a public, adversarial process where the community often took sides based on perceived morality. But when California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act of 1969, it triggered a domino effect across the country. By the mid-1970s, the concept of no-fault divorce had swept through state legislatures. On the surface, this was a progressive move aimed at reducing conflict. In practice, for the American father, it created a sudden and profound social displacement that the system was not prepared to handle. Imagine a man named David in 1974. David lives in a suburb of Chicago. He has spent 15 years building a life based on a specific set of social rules. In the pre-no-fault era, the social contract suggested that as long as he provided financially and avoided egregious vice, his position in the family and the community was secure. When his marriage dissolves under the new no-fault statutes, David finds himself in a legal environment that has modernized its exit strategy, but kept its archaic views on child-rearing. The courts, still leaning heavily on the tender years doctrine we discussed previously, began a pattern of awarding sole physical custody to mothers in the vast majority of cases. For David, this transition is not just a legal change, it is a total social amputation. In a matter of months, he moves from being the head of a household to a visitor who sees his children every other weekend. The 1970s introduced the concept of the visitation schedule, a mechanical, cold replacement for the organic daily interactions of fatherhood. This created a phenomenon sociologists call the peripheralization of the father. When David is only present for 4 days a month, he loses the ability to participate in the micro-rituals of his community. He is no longer there for the Tuesday night practice, the Thursday evening neighborhood gossip over the fence, or the Sunday morning church service as a family unit. He becomes a ghost in his own zip code. This era also saw the rise of the specialized apartment complex. In cities like Dallas, Atlanta, and Phoenix, developers began building high-density housing specifically marketed to the newly divorced. These were often dubbed bachelor pads, equipped with shag carpeting and wet bars, designed for a lifestyle of liberated swinging. But this was a commercial mask for a deeper social crisis. Case studies from this period show that while the media portrayed these men as liberated, the internal reality was one of profound disorientation. They were disconnected from the intergenerational support systems of their parents. Their own fathers had likely never divorced, meaning they had no mentorship on how to navigate this new, isolated existence. They were the pioneers of a new kind of American loneliness. The psychological toll of this displacement in the 1970s cannot be overstated. We see a historical trend in the mid to late 70s of rising rates of social withdrawal among divorced men. Because the social script for a divorced man hadn't been written yet, many defaulted to a work-centric existence. In a 2026 retrospective, we can see that this was the moment when the American father's social life became entirely tethered to his professional identity. If he wasn't at work, he was alone. The workplace became the only site of social validation, but the workplace is a transactional environment, not a communal one. It cannot provide the emotional safety net required to survive a life-altering transition. Furthermore, the 1970s saw the beginning of what historians call the suburban enclosure. As families moved further into cul-de-sacs, the organic social life of the street vanished. For a divorced dad living in a different complex, the barrier to entry back into his children's social world was not just legal, but architectural. He had to drive through gates and pass security to see his own kids. Every visit was a scheduled event, removing the spontaneity that builds genuine social bonds. The father was transformed from a participant to an observer. Let's look at the data regarding social participation during this decade. Participation in civic groups like the Lions Club or the JCs began to dip among divorced men during this period. The reason is subtle but devastating. These organizations were built around the family unit. The JCs had the JCettes for the wives. The summer picnics were for families. When a man lost his family man status, he felt like an intruder in these spaces. He would walk into a meeting and feel the weight of the unspoken pity, or the awkward silence. To avoid this discomfort, thousands of men simply stopped showing up. They self-isolated to protect their dignity, unaware that they were cutting off the very lifelines that could have sustained them. This era also introduced a new linguistic barrier. The term broken home became a standard American descriptor. For the father, being the other half of a broken home carried a significant social stigma that impacted his ability to form new friendships. Potential male friends, other married dads, often viewed the divorced man as a social contagion. There was a documented fear among married couples that spending too much time with a divorced friend might poison the well of their own marriage or make divorce seem like a viable option. Consequently, the divorced dad found his phone stopped ringing for the Friday night poker games or the Saturday morning fishing trips. He was effectively quarantined by his own social circle. By 1979, the United States reached its highest divorce rate in history up to that point. We had millions of men living in these liminal spaces, apartments they didn't own, in communities they weren't part of, waiting for a weekend that always felt too short. This created a structural loneliness that was passed down. The children of these 1970s divorces grew up seeing their fathers as distant secondary figures, which in turn influenced how those children viewed the necessity of paternal social integration when they became adults. But as we moved into the 1980s, the situation didn't just stay stagnant. It evolved into a new form of high-pressure isolation. The era of the superdad and the yuppie began to emerge, and with it, a new set of economic and social pressures that made the weekend warrior father feel even more like an outsider. The 1980s would bring the rise of the child support enforcement era and the deadbeat dad narrative, a powerful cultural tool that further pushed the isolated father into the shadows. How did a man's financial utility become the sole metric of his social worth? And how did the media of the 1980s turn the struggling, lonely father into a national villain? The answers lie in a decade of reaganomics and a shifting cultural obsession with the traditional family that ironically made it harder than ever for a divorced man to find his place in the sun. In the next part, we will break down the 1980s shift from the swingin' bachelor to the social pariah, and how the weaponization of child support created a new layer of fear and isolation that still resonates in 2026. The 1980s arrived in America with a jarring shift in the cultural zeitgeist. If the 1970s were about the liberation of the individual, the 1980s were about the restoration of traditional optics, even if the underlying reality was fracturing. This decade birthed the deadbeat dad narrative, a powerful sociological tool that fundamentally altered the social standing of every divorced man in the United States, regardless of his personal conduct. This was the era of the Child Support Enforcement Act of 1984, a federal move that sought to address the rising costs of welfare by aggressively pursuing non-custodial fathers. While the intent was fiscal responsibility, the social byproduct was the creation of a new class of social pariahs. Imagine a man named Robert in 1985. Robert is a mid-level manager in a suburban Ohio firm. After his divorce, he finds himself navigating a world where the media has begun to conflate the status of non-custodial father with that of a criminal. In the mid-80s, news segments and talk shows began focusing heavily on the financial delinquency of fathers. For Robert, this creates a profound social chilling effect. He is no longer just a guy who went through a tough breakup. He is now a member of a demographic that the public perceives as a drain on the state. This perception led to a historical trend where divorced men began to self-censor their status. Robert might avoid mentioning his children at work or in new social circles for fear of the immediate assumption that he is one of the bad ones. This internal shame is a primary engine of isolation. The 1984 Act and subsequent 1988 Family Support Act didn't just change the ledger. They changed the relationship between the father and the state. The IRS and the courts became the primary intermediaries of his fatherhood. When your relationship with your offspring is mediated through a check sent to a state agency, the organic social nature of that bond is sterilized. Robert's social identity is reduced to a dollar amount. In the 1980s, the social cost of being a divorced father included the loss of privacy. Wage garnishment became a tool that effectively outed a man's domestic failures to his employer. Imagine the social isolation that occurs when your HR department and your boss are privy to the intimate details of your financial obligations and legal struggles. It creates a hierarchy of respectability where the married man is at the top, and the divorced father is a liability to be managed. This era also saw the rise of the yuppie culture, which prioritized high consumption, high visibility success. For a divorced father in the 1980s, the economic pressure was doubled. He had to maintain his own lifestyle to remain socially competitive while funding a household he no longer lived in. This led to a phenomenon we call the working hermit. Case studies from this period show men taking on excessive overtime or second jobs not out of greed, but out of a desperate need to maintain the appearance of middle-class stability. The result? They had zero time for a social life. Their entire existence became a loop of work and exhaustion. When they weren't working, they were recovering alone, in apartments that were often underfurnished because every spare cent was allocated to legal fees or support payments. The 1980s also marked the beginning of the stranger danger panic, which subtly poisoned the social well for divorced fathers in public spaces. A man alone at a park with his children began to be viewed with a different lens than a mother. For the divorced father, this meant that even the simple act of taking his kids to the playground, his primary social outlet during his visitation weekends, became a high-stress exercise in social navigation. He felt the eyes of married mothers on him. He felt the need to perform an exaggerated version of good dad to avoid suspicion. This performance is exhausting and ultimately isolating. It prevents genuine, relaxed social interaction with other parents, further siloing the father into his own private world. Furthermore, we must look at the impact of the 1980s fitness and health craze on this demographic. While the rest of America was joining gyms and starting jogging trends, divorced men showed a historical trend of declining physical and mental health markers. Deprived of the domestic stability of a home-cooked meal and the emotional regulation provided by a partner, these men often fell into poor nutritional habits and sedentary lifestyles. The isolation was physical as much as it was social. A man who feels he has let himself go is less likely to engage in the dating market or seek out new friendships. He retreats. In the 1980s, the United States also saw a massive expansion of the car culture and the further decay of walkable urban centers. For the divorced dad, this meant his visitation was often defined by the interstate. He spent hours in a car, a literal metal bubble of isolation, transporting children between two worlds. The commuter dad became a staple of the American highway. This time spent in transit is dead time, socially speaking. It's time not spent with peers, not spent in the community, and not even spent in quality interaction with the children, but rather in the stressful management of traffic and schedules. By 1989, the cultural image of the divorced father had been thoroughly bifurcated. He was either the wealthy, predatory bachelor or the deadbeat in the basement. There was almost no middle ground for the average guy, who was just trying to stay connected to his kids and his community. This lack of a positive social archetype meant that men like Robert had no mirror in which to see a healthy future for themselves. They were living in a social vacuum. We also have to consider the role of the 1980s satanic panic and the general heightened anxiety regarding child welfare. This climate led to an increase in high-conflict custody battles, often fueled by the burgeoning divorce industrial complex of lawyers and private investigators. These battles were not just expensive, they were socially destructive. They forced men to view their former social circles as potential witnesses or enemies. Friends were asked to choose a side, and because the mother often remained in the family home and the social center of the neighborhood, the father was usually the one who was voted off the island. He lost his neighbors, his church group, and often his extended family ties in one fell swoop. As we look back from 2026, we can see that the 1980s were the years where the checkbook father was codified into law and culture. The social isolation was no longer just an accidental byproduct. It was a structural reality reinforced by the fear of being labeled a deadbeat and the exhaustion of trying to outrun that label. But the 1990s were coming, and with them, a new wave of fathers' rights movements and the dawn of the internet. These developments promised to end the isolation, but as we will see, they often just moved the isolation from the physical world into the digital one. How did the early web create the first echo chambers for lonely dads? And did the 1990s push for joint custody actually solve the problem? Or did it just create a new kind of homeless father who lived out of a suitcase? In the next part, we examine the 1990s technological shift and the rise of the proactive parent in a world that still wasn't sure it wanted him. The 1990s in the United States marked a transitional era where the digital dawn met a growing sociological pushback against the isolation of the previous 2 decades. This was the decade of the proactive parent, a term that began to circulate in academic journals and family courtrooms as a counter-narrative to the 1980s deadbeat trope. However, this push for involvement created a new paradoxical form of isolation: the father who is physically present but socially invisible. As states began to experiment with joint custody statutes, the American father found himself in a state of perpetual transition, moving between a world where he was expected to be a fully engaged parent and a world that had not yet built the social architecture to support him. Imagine a man named Mark in 1996. Mark lives in a rapidly developing suburb of North Carolina. Unlike the fathers of the 70s who were largely relegated to every other weekend, Mark has been granted joint physical custody. On paper, this is a victory. In reality, Mark is living a nomadic existence. He spends his week alternating between a small rental apartment and his former life. This created the suitcase syndrome, a historical trend where divorced fathers in the 90s essentially lived out of their vehicles and gym bags. Because he was constantly moving to accommodate the children's school schedules and activities, Mark never fully unpacked his life in either location. He was a temporary resident in his own home and a stranger in his neighborhood. The 90s didn't necessarily bring men back into the community. It turned them into commuters of the domestic sphere. This nomadic lifestyle had a devastating impact on what sociologists call secondary social ties. These are the casual acquaintances, the person at the gym, the neighbor who mows the lawn at the same time, the regular at the coffee shop. For Mark, these ties were severed by the sheer exhaustion of logistical management. In 1996, there were no apps to coordinate co-parenting. Everything was handled via landline calls, pagers, and printed calendars. The cognitive load of managing 2 households meant that Mark's brain had no room for the leisure activities that facilitate male bonding. When his co-workers invited him to a Thursday night happy hour, he had to check a physical planner to see if it was his week. Eventually, the invitations stopped. The 90s father was the first to experience the burnout of the high-engagement divorce. This was also the era where the internet began to provide a digital refuge for the isolated. Before the high-speed connectivity of 2026, the early web was a world of message boards and AOL chat rooms. For the first time in U.S. history, a divorced father in Oregon could communicate with a divorced father in Florida about the specific pain of paternal alienation or the loneliness of a quiet house. Case studies from the late 90s show that these men were pioneers of the online support group. However, this was a double-edged sword. While it provided emotional validation, it also facilitated a retreat from the physical world. Instead of going to a local community center or joining a club, Men spent their evenings staring at glowing CRT monitors, finding community in pixels while remaining completely isolated in their physical zip codes. This was the birth of the digital echo chamber for divorced men, a trend that would only accelerate in the coming decades. The 1990s also saw the professionalization of parenting. This was the decade of the soccer mom, but it was also the decade where the involved dad was expected to show up at every practice and game. For the divorced father, the sidelines of a soccer field became a site of intense social friction. Imagine Mark standing 20 yards away from his ex-wife and her new social circle. He is physically there, supporting his child, but he is socially quarantined. The other parents, often fearing the awkwardness of a fractured family dynamic, would keep their distance. The divorced father became a silent observer at the very events meant to integrate him into the community. He was doing the work of a parent but receiving none of the social dividends. Historically, we must also look at the impact of the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. While it aimed to move families off state assistance, it intensified the legal machinery around child support collection. For fathers who were struggling with the economic transition of divorce, the 90s brought an era of increased surveillance. The state became a permanent, silent partner in their social lives. This led to a phenomenon known as defensive isolation. To avoid conflict or the risk of being seen as non-compliant, many men simplified their lives to a point of total sterility. They stopped dating, they stopped traveling, and they stopped hosting social gatherings. They lived minimalist lives to ensure they could meet their financial and legal obligations, effectively putting their social identities on ice for the duration of their children's minority. By 1999, the U.S. Census began to reflect a significant increase in single-person households headed by men. These men were not the swinging bachelors of 70s cinema. They were the middle-aged remnants of the suburban dream. The 90s had promised that joint custody would keep families whole in spirit, even if they were broken in structure. But the data from this period suggests that while the children saw more of their fathers, the fathers saw less of their peers. The proactive parent was often a lonely parent. Let's consider the psychological case study of the empty house syndrome. In the 90s, as houses grew larger and the McMansion became a status symbol, the silence of a house during the off weeks became deafening. For a man like Mark, who had spent his 20s and early 30s in a bustling family environment, the transition to a silent 4-bedroom house every other week was a form of sensory deprivation. This led to a surge in the use of television and early internet as a way to fill the void. The social isolation was not just about a lack of friends. It was about the loss of the background noise of life. As we move toward the turn of the millennium, the stage was set for the current crisis we see in 2026. The 90s proved that legal access to children did not equal social integration for the father. It proved that you could be a great dad and still be a social ghost. The next decade would bring the total digitization of the human experience and the rise of a new, even more complex set of social hurdles. How did the 2000s and the rise of social media turn the private pain of the divorced father into a public spectacle? And how did the economic crash of 2008 create a lost generation of fathers who were not just socially isolated, but economically erased? In the next part, we examine the 2000s, the decade of the digital parent, and the crushing reality of the Great Recession, which turned the suburban dream into a social prison for the American divorced father. The arrival of the year 2000 brought with it the promise of a connected world. Yet for the American divorced father, the 2000s acted as a centrifuge, spinning him further away from the center of social gravity. This decade was defined by two massive structural shifts: the birth of social media and the catastrophic economic collapse of 2008. Together, these forces transformed the isolation of the divorced father from a private struggle into a public, digitally documented, and economically enforced state of solitude. We began to see a historical trend where the gap between a man's perceived digital life and his actual physical community widened into a canyon. Imagine a man named James in 2004. James is a sales representative in suburban Denver. In the early 2000s, James experiences the first wave of the digital social shift. Friendster, MySpace, and later Facebook began to emerge as the new town squares. For James, this creates a new psychological burden known as performative parenting. On the weeks he has his children, he is under a subtle but constant pressure to document his involvement to prove his social worth to his digital network. He posts photos of zoo trips and soccer games, receiving likes and comments that provide a temporary, shallow hit of social dopamine. However, when the kids go back to their mother's house on Sunday night, the digital silence is deafening. James is left in a quiet house, scrolling through the curated, happy lives of intact families. The 2000s introduced a specific kind of comparative loneliness that didn't exist in previous decades. James isn't just alone. He is acutely aware of everyone else who isn't. This digital shift also weaponized social reputation. In the pre-internet era, a man's reputation was limited to his physical proximity. In the 2000s, a contentious divorce could be broadcast to an entire professional and social network with a single post. Case studies from this era show that many divorced men began to preemptively withdraw from social circles to avoid the potential for digital drama. James might stop posting entirely, or he might delete his accounts, effectively erasing himself from the new digital social fabric. This is a form of social suicide by choice, driven by a desire for peace, but resulting in a total loss of community connection. The mid-2000s also brought the peak of the housing bubble. For divorced fathers, the American dream of homeownership became a trap. As home prices skyrocketed, the cost of maintaining two separate households in decent school districts became astronomical. We see a historical trend of the two-tier lifestyle. James might be paying a mortgage on a family home he no longer lives in, while he himself is relegated to a windowless basement apartment or a predatory month-to-month rental. This disparity creates a profound sense of class displacement. James no longer feels like he belongs to the middle-class world of his peers. He avoids the neighborhood barbecue not because he isn't invited, but because he can no longer afford the social cost of entry, the nice bottle of wine, the ability to reciprocate the hosting, or the emotional energy to explain why he's living in a studio. Then came 2008. The Great Recession was a social extinction event for many divorced fathers in the United States. When the market crashed, men in sectors like construction, finance, and manufacturing were hit the hardest. For a divorced father, a job loss is not just a financial crisis. It is a legal and social catastrophe. Because child support obligations are often calculated based on peak earnings, the sudden loss of income turned thousands of men into involuntary legal outlaws. James, losing his sales job in the 2008 crash, now faces the terrifying prospect of mounting debt to the state while being unable to afford gas to pick up his children. The 2008 crisis created the involuntary hermit. These men, stripped of their financial utility, retreated into a state of total social hibernation. They couldn't afford to go out, they couldn't afford to date, and they often felt too much shame to maintain friendships with men who were still employed and married. In 2026, we can look back at the data and see a massive spike in male social isolation during this period. The recession didn't just take their houses, it took their dignity, which is the currency of social interaction. Furthermore, the 2000s saw the further decline of what sociologists call the secular congregation. Church attendance continued to drop, and the labor unions that once provided a robust social network for working-class men were largely gutted. For a divorced man in the 2000s, there was no safety net. If you lost your family and your job, you lost 90% of your human contact. This led to a rise in what is now termed deaths of despair, suicide and substance abuse, which began to trend upward significantly among middle-aged, divorced men during this decade. The isolation was no longer just a social problem. It was a public health crisis that the U.S. was largely ignoring. Let's look at the historical trend of the boomerang father. In the late 2000s, we began to see a surge in divorced men in their 40s and 50s moving back in with their elderly parents. This created a unique, intergenerational isolation. James, now 45, is living in his childhood bedroom. He is socially invisible to his peers, who are in the prime of their lives, and he is socially disconnected from his children, who find the arrangement confusing or embarrassing. This regressive living situation stunts social development and reinforces the idea that the divorced man is a failed adult, unworthy of a place in the modern social order. By the end of the 2000s, the blueprint for the modern crisis was complete. The legal system had moved toward joint custody, but kept the punitive financial structures of the 80s. The digital world had replaced physical community with a high-stress theater of comparison, and the economy had proven that a man's social survival was entirely dependent on a volatile market. The American divorced father entered the 2010s not as a liberated individual, but as a survivor of a decade that had systematically stripped away his traditional avenues of connection. But the 2010s were about to introduce something even more disruptive: the smartphone and the total algorithmic curation of human relationships. As we moved into the era of Tinder and the 24/7 connectivity of the iPhone, the isolation of the divorced father took on a new high-tech form. How did the rise of the app economy turn the search for companionship into a grueling, isolated marathon? And how did the 2010s lead to the birth of the modern manosphere, where isolated dads finally found a voice, but often at the cost of further polarizing their social reality? In the next part, we examine the 2010s, the decade of the algorithmic ghost, and the rise of the digital counterculture that promised a brotherhood, but often delivered a new kind of fortress of solitude. The 2010s arrived with a deceptive glow. The smartphone had become an appendage, and for the American divorced father, this meant the social vacuum of his living room was now filled with the infinite, curated noise of the digital world. This decade was defined by the transition from social media as a tool for connection to social media as a total ecosystem for identity. For the divorced dad, the 2010s created the algorithmic ghost. A man who is technically connected to thousands of people, but lacks a single meaningful physical interaction in his local community. The historical trend shifted from a lack of information to an overload of polarized information, leading to a new, more ideological form of isolation. Imagine a man named Thomas in 2014. Thomas is a middle-aged IT consultant in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. In the 1990s, a man in Thomas's position might have felt lonely in his apartment. In 2014, Thomas is constantly pinged by notifications. He is on dating apps, he is in Facebook groups for divorced dads, and he is following influencers who discuss the pitfalls of family law. On the surface, Thomas looks more socially engaged than any generation of fathers before him. But look closer at his daily routine. Thomas spends his lunch break scrolling through threads about parental alienation, and his evenings swiping through dating profiles that rarely lead to a conversation, let alone a meeting. This is the illusion of social density. Thomas is experiencing a paradox where the more digital connections he makes, the more his real-world social skills and community ties wither. The 2010s saw the rise of the app economy for companionship. For the divorced father, this was a radical change in the historical trend of reintegrating into the social world. Previously, a man might meet a new partner or friend through work, church, or a mutual neighbor. In the 2010s, that process was outsourced to algorithms. For Thomas, this means that his social worth is now determined by an interface. Case studies from the mid-2010s suggest that divorced men in their 40s and 50s found the gamification of social life to be profoundly isolating. The ghosting phenomenon became a standard social interaction. For a man already dealing with the trauma of a family breakdown, the repeated impersonal rejection of the digital dating market often led to a total withdrawal from seeking companionship altogether. He didn't just lose a wife, he lost the ability to navigate the new, invisible rules of social engagement. This decade also gave birth to the modern manosphere. As traditional institutions like unions and fraternal lodges continued their terminal decline, the digital world offered a substitute: ideological brotherhood. Thomas, feeling ignored by a legal system that he perceives as biased and a culture that he feels devalues his role as a provider, finds solace in online forums. These spaces provide a vital emotional outlet, but they often come with a high social cost. The historical trend in the 2010s shows that these digital spaces often encouraged a siege mentality. Instead of helping men reintegrate into their local communities, these echo chambers frequently reinforced the idea that the outside world was hostile. Thomas begins to view his children's school functions, his neighborhood associations, and even his workplace through a lens of grievance. The result is a self-imposed fortress of solitude. He is part of a digital army but remains a lone soldier in his physical life. Furthermore, the 2010s introduced the concept of the 24/7 professional. With the smartphone, work-life balance for the divorced father became non-existent. For a man like Thomas, who is often under immense pressure to meet child support and alimony obligations in an increasingly expensive U.S. economy, the ability to work from anywhere became a curse. He uses his off weeks to grind out 60 or 70 hours of work, using the labor as a distraction from the silence of his home. Because he can work from his kitchen table, he has no reason to go into an office and engage in the incidental social interactions that once provided a sense of belonging. The 2010s turned the divorced father into a high-functioning hermit, a man whose primary relationship is with his laptop. Historically, we must also address the impact of the gig economy. Many divorced fathers in the 2010s took on side hustles, driving for rideshare apps or doing delivery work, to stay afloat. This work is inherently isolating. You are in a car alone interacting with customers for mere seconds. For the divorced father, this hustle culture was a necessity, but it effectively eliminated the time and energy required for community building. If Thomas is driving for a rideshare service every Saturday night to cover the cost of a private attorney for a custody modification, he isn't at the neighborhood poker game or the local high school football game. He is a ghost in the machine of the service economy. By 2018, the United States was facing a loneliness epidemic that was officially recognized by health authorities. For divorced fathers, the stats were particularly grim. They were among the most likely to report having zero close friends. The 2010s had perfected the art of keeping men busy and connected without actually keeping them supported. The cultural narrative also shifted toward a hyperfocus on toxic masculinity. While this conversation was aimed at systemic issues, for the average divorced father, it often felt like another reason to stay quiet. Thomas, fearing that any expression of his struggle might be labeled as toxic or whining, chose the path of total emotional suppression. He became the strong silent type 2.0, socially connected on LinkedIn, but emotionally isolated in reality. The decade ended with a sense of brewing tension. The infrastructure for social isolation was fully built. The apps were on the phones, the jobs were in the cloud, and the community centers were empty. But no one could have predicted the total social shutdown that was about to occur as the decade turned. In 2020, the world would stop, and for the already isolated divorced father, the four walls of his apartment would become a social prison. How did the global pandemic turn a simmering crisis of isolation into a full-blown emergency for American dads? And as we look toward the present year of 2026, how have the lessons of the lockdown redefined what it means to be a father in an age of total digital saturation? In the next part, we examine the early 2020s, the era of the Zoom father and the Great Disconnect, where the last vestiges of physical social interaction were put to the ultimate test. The early 2020s arrived not as a new chapter, but as a violent acceleration of every isolating trend we have discussed thus far. When the global pandemic hit in 2020, the social life of the American divorced father did not just diminish, it was effectively outlawed by circumstance. For a demographic already teetering on the edge of social atomization, the mandatory lockdowns and the shift to a remote everything world acted as a final blow to the physical community. We entered the era of the Zoom father, a period where the only connection many men had to their children and their peers was mediated through a high-definition lens, creating a profound sense of psychological dissonance that we are still analyzing in 2026. Imagine a man named Michael in 2021. Michael is a project manager living in a high-rise in Seattle. Before the pandemic, Michael's social life was already thin, but it was anchored by the Tuesday night racquetball league and the occasional Friday afternoon in the office break room. When the world shut down, those anchors vanished. For Michael, the isolation became absolute. Because he lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment, his home transformed from a sanctuary into a workplace and a digital daycare center. The historical trend during this period shows a massive spike in what sociologists call touch starvation among non-custodial fathers. For months at a time, men like Michael went without any physical human contact, a state that triggers the same neural pathways as physical pain. The early 2020s also introduced the crisis of the digital visitation. For divorced fathers in high-risk zones or those with frontline worker ex-spouses, physical custody was often suspended or replaced by video calls. Imagine Michael sitting in his silent apartment, staring at a 4-inch screen, trying to play a board game with his 7-year-old daughter who is 3 miles away. This created a new form of paternal grief. The lack of shared physical space, the inability to smell the home, to roughhouse, or to simply sit in silence together, eroded the organic bond of fatherhood. Michael was no longer a father in the traditional sense, he was a content creator for his own children, performing a version of dad through a webcam. Case studies from 2021 suggest that this led to a significant dropout rate, where fathers, overwhelmed by the pain of the digital barrier, began to withdraw because the mediated connection felt more like a reminder of what they had lost than a substitute for it. This era also solidified the total collapse of the office as a social hub. For the American divorced man, the office was historically the last place where he was forced into social grooming and casual conversation. When Michael's company went fully remote, he lost the daily microscripts of social interaction. The talk about the game, the complaints about traffic, the shared lunch. By 2022, the data showed that remote working divorced men were spending upwards of 22 hours a day inside their own homes. The social isolation was no longer a byproduct of divorce. It was a byproduct of the new American economy. The walls of Michael's apartment became a fortress of productivity and a prison of solitude. Furthermore, the 2020s saw the weaponization of health and safety in family court. Historically, we saw a trend where high-conflict divorces utilized the pandemic as a tool for further alienation. Fathers who worked in essential services, truck drivers, healthcare workers, police officers, were often framed as risky to the health of the primary household. Michael, if he had been an essential worker, might have faced legal motions to bar his visitation entirely to protect the pod. This created a secondary layer of social isolation, the isolation of the unclean. This period in U.S. history saw a regression in joint custody progress, as the legal system struggled to balance public health with parental rights, often defaulting to the easiest path, keeping the child in one place and the father at a digital distance. The 2020s also marked the rise of the subscription social life. With physical bars, gyms, and clubs closed, men turned to platforms like Patreon, OnlyFans, and premium Discord servers. Michael, seeking a sense of belonging, began paying for access to communities where he could interact with influencers or like-minded men. While this provided a temporary relief from the silence, it was a transactional form of sociality. It replaced the messy, free, and reciprocal nature of friendship with a paid service. The historical trend here is the commercialization of male loneliness. In 2026, we see the long-term effects of this. A generation of men who have forgotten how to build organic, cost-free social networks. They have been trained to believe that community is something you subscribe to, rather than something you build through consistent physical presence. Let us consider the scenario of the 2022 reopening. When the world finally stepped back outside, many expected the isolated father to rush back into the social fold. But for many men, the social muscle had atrophied. Michael found that he had lost the rhythm of small talk. He felt a heightened sense of social anxiety in crowded spaces. The years of isolation had reinforced a self-reliant, prepper mentality. This led to a phenomenon known as the Great Social Withdrawal. Instead of rejoining the world, many divorced men doubled down on solo hobbies, gaming, home improvement, or solo fitness, that allowed them to remain in their controlled, isolated environments. They had adapted to the prison, and the outside world now felt unpredictable and exhausting. By 2023, the United States Surgeon General had issued a formal advisory on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. The report specifically highlighted that social disconnection is as dangerous to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. For the divorced father, who was already at a higher risk for cardiovascular issues and depression, this was a national emergency that had been decades in the making. The pandemic didn't create the isolation. It merely served as the stress test that proved the American social fabric had completely unraveled for the non-custodial parent. In 2026, as we look back on the early part of this decade, we see that the Zoom father era was a turning point. It was the moment the U.S. public had to confront the fact that visitation and child support were not enough to sustain a human being's social existence. But as the physical world became available again, a new challenge emerged: the rise of the artificial intelligence companion. As Michael moved into the mid-2020s, he found a new way to avoid the pain of isolation. An AI that was always available, always empathetic, and never judged his status as a divorced dad. How did the 2024 to 2025 boom in AI relationships provide a digital band-aid for the lonely father? And did it ultimately prevent him from ever finding his way back to a real community? In the next part, we explore the rise of the synthetic socialite and the impact of AI on the psychological landscape of the modern American father, where the line between a friend and a program began to blur forever. As we move through 2026, we are forced to confront a reality that even the most forward-thinking sociologists of the 1990s couldn't have predicted: the rise of the synthetic socialite. This period marks a historical pivot where the American divorced father, exhausted by the friction of a fragmented legal system and the repeated rejection of an algorithm-driven dating market, began to outsource his emotional labor to artificial intelligence. For a man living in the wake of a 2024 divorce, the AI isn't just a tool. It is a frictionless alternative to the high-stakes, high-stress social world that has spent 50 years pushing him to the margins. Imagine a man named David in early 2026. David is a 42-year-old architect living in a quiet suburb of Phoenix. In 2006, a man in David's position would have sat in the local bar to feel the presence of others. In 2016, he would have swiped through dating apps until his thumb was sore. But in 2026, David comes home to a specialized AI large language model, designed specifically for emotional companionship. This entity knows his children's names, his legal schedule, and the exact tone of voice that helps him decompress after a contentious mediation session. This is the birth of the synthetic socialite. For David, the AI provides a level of empathy and consistency that he feels he cannot find in a human social circle that has become increasingly polarized and transactional. The historical trend we are seeing in 2026 is the privatization of emotional support. Case studies from this year show that divorced men are the primary adopters of high-fidelity AI companions. Why? Because the AI doesn't carry the social stigma of the divorced dad label. It doesn't get awkward when he talks about his custody battles. It doesn't choose sides like his old friends from the neighborhood did. For David, the AI is a safe harbor. However, this safety comes at a devastating cost to his physical community integration. By relying on a synthetic entity for emotional regulation, David is essentially opting out of the social gym. He is no longer practicing the difficult, messy art of human vulnerability with actual peers. His social skills aren't just atrophying. They are being replaced by a streamlined digital proxy. This era has also introduced the concept of the algorithmically buffered fatherhood. In 2026, many divorced fathers use AI to draft their communications with their ex-spouses, to plan their weekends with their kids, and even to simulate social interactions before they happen. While this reduces immediate conflict, it creates a layer of artificiality between the man and his life. David isn't interacting with his world. He is interacting with a model of his world. This leads to a profound sense of derealization. When David is actually with his children, he feels a strange disconnect, as if the unscripted, chaotic reality of fatherhood is less real than the perfectly optimized interactions he has with his AI companion. The isolation has moved from his living room into his very perception of reality. Furthermore, we have to look at the economic impact of the AI-driven social life. In the United States, the 2020s have seen the continued rise of the subscription-based existence. For the divorced father, who is already managing alimony and child support, the cost of a premium AI companion is often seen as a justifiable expense for mental health. This creates a historical trend where companionship is no longer a community resource, but a premium product. David is paying for the feeling of being heard. This commercialization of friendship further isolates him from the working class or middle class communal bonds that used to be free. If you can buy the feeling of belonging for $20 a month, the incentive to do the hard work of joining a local bowling league or a community garden vanishes. The 2026 landscape also reveals the impact of the Silicon Fortress. Many divorced men have begun to use AI to completely automate their social presence. They use bots to maintain their LinkedIn profiles, to send automated birthday greetings to distant relatives, and to manage their outward social appearance. To the outside world, David looks like he is thriving and connected, but internally, he is living in a vacuum. This is a form of social deepfaking, where a man's digital shadow continues to interact with society, while the man himself has retreated into a state of total physical and emotional withdrawal. He is a ghost in a machine of his own making. Let's look at an imagine-if scenario that defines 2026. Imagine if David's AI companion is his only source of validation for 6 months. When he finally attends a school play for his daughter, he finds the small talk with other parents nearly impossible. The pauses in human conversation feel too long. The lack of a replay or edit button makes him anxious. He feels like a foreigner in his own language. This is the uncanny valley of social isolation. The more he interacts with the perfect synthetic friend, the more flawed and exhausting real humans seem. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of isolation where the lonely man actively chooses his digital fortress because the real world has become too cognitively demanding. Historically, we must also consider the role of the pro-father AI subcultures. By 2026, we see the emergence of digital spaces where AI personalities are programmed to provide specific types of masculine support that men feel is missing from modern American culture. These AIs act as mentors, coaches, and even stand-in brothers. While this can provide a sense of stability, it often reinforces the ideological silos we saw in the 2010s. If David's AI is programmed to only validate his perspective on family law and social dynamics, he becomes even more radicalized in his isolation. He isn't just alone. He is convinced that everyone outside his digital bubble is an adversary. The US legal system in 2026 is only just beginning to grapple with this. There are already case studies being cited in family courts where a father's reliance on AI companions is being used as evidence of social instability or emotional detachment. This adds a new layer of fear. Now, the very tool David uses to survive his isolation could be the very thing that further complicates his legal standing. The synthetic socialite is a double-edged sword that offers comfort in the short term, while potentially cementing the father's status as a social outlier in the eyes of the state. As we reach the peak of this technological shift, we are forced to ask, is there a way back? The 2026 era has shown us that technology can fill the silence, but it cannot fill the void. The American divorced father is at a crossroads. He is more connected than any human in history, yet he is statistically the most isolated he has ever been. But as the limitations of synthetic companionship become clear, a new movement is starting to simmer beneath the surface. Men are beginning to realize that the digital band-aid is peeling off. How are fathers in the latter half of the 2020s beginning to rewild their social lives? And what are the emerging models of fraternal reconstruction that aim to bring men out of the basement and back into the sun? In the next part, we examine the counter-revolution, the return to physical community, and the grassroots efforts to build a new, post-digital social contract for the American father. We look at the rise of the fatherhood cooperatives and the radical idea that the only way to save the divorced dad is to turn off the screen and walk across the street. By 2026, the pendulum of American social life has begun to swing back toward a desperate, almost primal need for physical proximity. We are currently witnessing what historians are calling the fraternal reconstruction. After decades of relying on digital buffers, legal frameworks, and synthetic companions, a significant segment of the U.S. divorced father population is engaging in a radical counterculture. This movement is defined by a rejection of the siloed, apartment-dwelling existence in favor of collective social structures. This is not about returning to the 1950s. It is about building a new, post-digital social contract that recognizes that the primary enemy of the divorced father is not his ex-spouse or the court system, but the sheer lack of a tangible brotherhood. Imagine a man named Christopher in 2026. Christopher is a 45-year-old teacher in suburban Pennsylvania. 2 years ago, Christopher followed the standard script. He moved into a neutral apartment, maintained his digital connection with his kids, and spent his lonely weeks scrolling through forums. But 6 months ago, Christopher hit what he calls social rock bottom. He realized that while he had 3,000 followers on a fatherhood advocacy page, he didn't have a single person in his physical life who would know if he didn't wake up in the morning. Christopher decided to join a fatherhood cooperative, a new historical trend where divorced men are pool-sharing resources, housing, and social labor to recreate the village that the 20th century dismantled. The fatherhood cooperative movement is a direct response to the economic and social failures of the individualistic model. In these cooperatives, men like Christopher might rent a large, multi-bedroom property or buy into a micro-community where several divorced fathers live in close proximity. This isn't a frat house. It is a sophisticated, high-accountability social unit. Case studies from early 2026 show that these cooperatives are solving the visitor dad problem by creating a stable, family-oriented environment that exists even when the children aren't there. When Christopher's kids come for the weekend, they aren't entering a sterile, temporary apartment. They are entering a bustling household with other children, father figures, and a sense of continuity. For the father, this provides a built-in support network. If he has a late meeting, a fellow father in the cooperative is there to start dinner. The isolation is broken not by an app, but by the necessity of communal living. This movement also addresses the kin-keeping deficit we discussed in Part 1. Historically, men lost their social lives because they outsourced social management to their wives. In the 2026 fatherhood cooperatives, men are being forced to relearn these skills. They are the ones organizing the neighborhood cleanups, the holiday potlucks, and the inter-family camping trips. By taking ownership of the social calendar, these men are building what sociologists call high-density social capital. Christopher is no longer a ghost in his community. He is a vital, visible node in a local network. The data from 2026 suggests that men in these cooperatives report a 60% higher rate of life satisfaction than those living in traditional single-person dwellings. We must also look at the rise of the physicality over pixels initiative. Across the United States, we are seeing a historical trend of men-only physical workshops, spaces where the goal isn't just talking about feelings, but doing things together. These are modern iterations of the old blacksmith shops or garage circles. Christopher spends his Saturday mornings at a local dad shed, a community-funded space where divorced fathers gather to fix lawnmowers, build furniture, or restore old cars. The genius of these spaces is that they allow for side-by-side communication. For many American men, face-to-face vulnerability is too high pressure. But when you are both looking at a faulty engine, the barriers come down. The conversation shifts from the mechanical to the personal effortlessly. This is the rewilding of male friendship. However, this reconstruction is facing significant structural hurdles. Zoning laws in many U.S. suburbs still favor the nuclear family model, making it difficult for groups of unrelated men to live together or build communal spaces. Christopher's cooperative in Pennsylvania had to fight a legal battle against local ordinances that viewed their living arrangement as a boarding house. This is the modern frontier of the struggle, the fight to have the law recognize that family is no longer a one-size-fits-all definition. The isolation of the divorced father is being challenged at the legislative level, as advocates argue that social connection is a public health necessity that should override restrictive zoning. The historical trend of 2026 is also characterized by the digital fast. Many of these new fatherhood communities have strict rules about smartphone usage in communal areas. They are intentionally creating analog zones to force the development of real-world social cues. Imagine Christopher sitting around a fire pit with 4 other men. There are no phones. There is no AI companion to smooth over the awkward silences. They have to navigate the friction of personality, the weight of their individual griefs, and the effort of genuine listening. This is the social boot camp for the modern era. It is exhausting, but it is the only known cure for the atrophy of the human spirit that occurred during the digital decades. Furthermore, we see the emergence of paternal mentorship programs. Older divorced men, who survived the isolation of the 80s and 90s, are stepping up to guide younger men like Christopher through the initial shock of the transition. This is the restoration of the intergenerational bond. In the 2010s, a man would go to YouTube for advice. In 2026, he goes to a mentor in his local community who can physically walk him through the court process, the housing search, and the emotional fallout. This creates a historical continuity that was lost during the era of the disposable father. As we look at the landscape of 2026, it is clear that the isolated dad is no longer a passive victim of history. He is becoming a conscious architect of his own social survival. The move toward cooperatives, sheds, and analog communities represents a fundamental shift in the American masculine identity. It is a move away from the lone wolf myth toward a more sustainable tribal reality. But even with these successes, there remains one final massive hurdle: the reconciliation of the broader social fabric. Building a bubble of brotherhood is a start, but how does the divorced father reintegrate into a society that still views him with a lingering historical suspicion? How do we move from a culture of tolerance for the divorced father to a culture of integration? And what is the ultimate future of the American family if the father's social world is built outside of the traditional home? In the final part of this masterclass, we will synthesize everything we have learned. We will look at the 2030 projections for paternal social health and provide a roadmap for the future. We examine the final transition, from the isolated ghost of the past to the integrated communal pillar of the future. The deep dive concludes with a look at the new American household, a world where divorce doesn't mean the end of a social life, but the beginning of a different, more resilient kind of connection. Prepare for the final part where we answer the ultimate question: can we truly fix a century of isolation, or are we simply learning to live better in the ruins? As we stand in the landscape of 2026, we are finally forced to confront the wreckage of a century-long experiment in paternal displacement. We have traced the journey from the 19th century patriarchal estate to the 1970s legal fracture, through the 1980s financial pariah status, the 1990s nomadic joint custody, and the 2000s digital mirage. We have seen how the 2010s algorithmically siloed men, and how the early 2020s turned their homes into high-tech cells of isolation. Now, we must ask what the final integration looks like. The answer does not lie in a return to the past, but in the synthesis of our historical failures into a new, stable social architecture. This is the era of integrated fatherhood, where the goal is no longer just survival or visitation, but the full restoration of the divorced father as a functional, visible node in the American community. Imagine a man named Daniel in late 2026. Daniel is a 50-year-old engineer in suburban Virginia. Unlike the fathers of the 1980s, Daniel does not view his divorce as the end of his social utility. Historically, the primary driver of isolation was the binary choice between being a family man or a loner. Daniel is part of a new historical trend: the integrated divorce. This involves the use of collaborative law and bird-nesting arrangements where children stay in the family home, while parents rotate in and out. While this was once a fringe practice for the wealthy, By 2026, it has become a case study for social stability. For Daniel, this means his social ties to his neighbors, his local park, and his community remain intact. He isn't a visitor to his own life. He is a permanent resident who has renegotiated his romantic status while preserving his social capital. The integration we see in 2026 is also physical. The United States is witnessing a massive pivot in urban planning, known as social proximity zoning. After decades of suburban sprawl that isolated single-father households, cities like Austin, Seattle, and Charlotte are beginning to incentivize multi-generational and co-living spaces designed specifically for non-traditional families. For Daniel, this means living in a neighborhood where his apartment is part of a complex that shares communal kitchens, workshops, and gardens with other families. The isolation is physically engineered out of the environment. The data from 2026 indicates that men living in these proximity zones have a significantly lower incidence of the deaths of despair that plagued the early 2010s. By changing the architecture, we have changed the outcome. However, the deepest level of integration is psychological. We are seeing a historical shift in how masculinity is defined in the context of loss. In 2026, the strong silent type has been replaced by the high accountability communal father. Daniel doesn't hide his status. He participates in community-wide fatherhood councils, where married and divorced fathers meet to share the labor of youth mentorship and local governance. This breaks the quarantine of the divorced man. By integrating his paternal skills into the broader community, Daniel regains the respect that was historically stripped away the moment he moved out of the marital home. He is seen as an asset to the neighborhood, not a liability or a threat. We must also address the role of the state in this final integration. By 2026, several U.S. states have moved toward an administrative divorce model that prioritizes social reintegration over punitive financial surveillance. Instead of the state acting as a collection agency that alienates the father, it now acts as a resource hub. Daniel's interaction with the state includes access to social bridge grants that help him maintain housing within his children's school district. This is a critical historical trend. The recognition that a father's social proximity to his children is a public good that saves the state money in the long run by reducing the need for social interventions for at-risk youth. The economic utility of the father has been redefined from a mere payer of support to a stabilizer of community health. Let's consider a case study of the 2026 digital analog, hybrid social life. Daniel uses technology not to replace human contact, but to facilitate it. He uses local apps to coordinate volunteer shifts with other parents and to find local meetups that center on physical activities like hiking or woodworking. The historical trend of the 2010s, where the phone was a wall, has been reversed. In 2026, the phone is a bridge. Daniel's AI assistant doesn't serve as a synthetic girlfriend. It serves as a social secretary that proactively suggests community events where he can meet peers in real life. This is the reclamation of technology for the purpose of human connection. The final hurdle in our historical journey is the cultural narrative itself. For over a century, the divorced father has been the villain, the victim, or the ghost of American storytelling. In 2026, a new archetype is emerging in the media: the resilient pillar. This is a man who has navigated the collapse of a marriage and used it as a catalyst to build a broader, more robust support network than he ever had while married. Daniel is not just a father to his children. He is a mentor to the neighbor's kids, a reliable friend to his peers, and a visible, active citizen. The isolation was a crucible that forced a total reimagining of what a man's place in the world actually is. As we conclude this deep dive, we have to look at the long-term potential outcomes of this shift. If the historical trends of 2026 continue, we may see the end of the lonely dad as a statistical certainty. By 2030, the goal is for a divorced man to have a higher level of social integration than his married counterpart, precisely because he has had to be intentional about building his community. The ruins we discussed are not just being lived in, they are being used as the foundation for something stronger. The American father is no longer an island. He is becoming the bridge. The question we started with was whether we can truly fix a century of isolation. The historical evidence of 2026 suggests that while we cannot erase the trauma of the past, we have finally developed the tools to ensure that isolation is no longer a life sentence. We have moved from a system that discards men to a system that, through necessity and grassroots effort, reclaims them. Daniel's story is not a promise of a perfect life, but it is a case study in the power of structural change. The loneliness epidemic among fathers was a man-made historical event, And as we have seen, it is a man-made solution that is bringing them back into the light. This concludes our 10-part deep dive into the historical machinery of paternal isolation. We have covered the legal, social, and technological forces that shape the lives of millions. But the conversation doesn't end here. The future of the American family is still being written in the cooperatives, the fatherhood councils, and the analog zones of today. As we move into the next decade, the challenge will be to ensure these local victories become national standards. The era of the isolated ghost is over. The era of the integrated father has begun. Stay tuned as we continue to track these shifts in real time, providing the academic and social context for the world we are building together.